Anushka Jain. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I will explain limiting factor analysis to you. Limiting factor analysis is a short term decision making technique used in management accounting when an organization faces a constraint or bottleneck. In real business scenarios, resources such as labor hours, machine hours, raw materials, or even market demand are often limited. You don't get everything unlimited, right? There can be limitations. When such a limitation or a constraint exists, management must decide how to allocate the scarce resource in a way that maximizes profit. Because ultimately, all the organizations are working with this goal of maximization of profit. Limiting factor analysis provides a systematic approach to make this decision. What decision are we talking about? Allocation of scarce resources. Very important to know that an organization is exposed to a scarce resource scenario. So, how to allocate the scarce resource in a way that maximizes profit? Very important. Okay. So, we have been talking about limiting factor analysis. What is a limiting factor? A limiting factor, also known as a key factor or a constraint, is any factor that restricts the level of output or activity of a business in the short run. So, anything which is restricting the output of an organization, that is called a limiting factor. Common examples include limited machine hours, shortage of skilled labor, restricted raw material supply, or limited production capacity. Since the organization cannot increase this resource in the short term, see what did I tell in the beginning? That limiting factor analysis is a short term decision making technique. So these resources where an organization is facing a shortage, they can't be increased overnight. They can't be increased in the short run. Therefore, the focus of the organization's management shifts from maximizing total contribution to maximizing contribution per unit of limiting factor. What did I just say? That the focus of the management shifts from maximizing total contribution to maximizing contribution per unit of the limiting factor. Okay. So you might be thinking, ma'am, why contribution? You just said maximization of profit. There's a reason. Why is contribution relevant and not profit? Okay. So I'll clarify that. Contribution is what? Sales minus variable cost is contribution. Fixed costs are ignored in this decision making. Why? Because in the short run, fixed costs remain unchanged. So fixed costs are completely ignored, only contribution is relevant to determine the ranking or the way to allocate the resources. Since the limiting factor restricts how much we can produce, the objective is not to maximize total sales, but to extract the maximum contribution from each scarce unit of the limiting resource. Okay, so I hope I've answered the question why contribution, why not profit? Why? Because in the short run, fixed costs are fixed, they will not change, so therefore irrelevant, right? So you must now be thinking, what is this core principle of limiting factor analysis? So the core principle or the fundamental principle of limiting factor analysis is very simple, that when a limiting factor exists, products must be ranked based on contribution per unit of the limiting factor. Please remember this, that the products are ranked based on contribution per unit of the limiting factor, not contribution per unit of the output, but contribution per unit of the limiting factor. The product that generates the highest contribution from one unit of the scarce resource gets priority in production. Okay. So that is the fundamental principle. It's very important. Which product gets the priority? The product which generates the highest contribution per unit of the limiting factor. So what I have just said, I'll just do a quick recap. Whenever a business faces a limitation of any resource, could be anything like labor hours, machine hours, raw materials, anything, then it performs a short-term decision making, allocate the resources in the best possible manner. So the ranking is done on the basis of contribution per unit of the limiting. That's what we have covered so far. Now, what are the steps in limiting factor analysis? Very important to understand that. The first step is to identify the limiting factor. Determine which resource is in short supply by comparing the resources required to meet the maximum demand. So you will be having multiple products. Each of the product will have their maximum demand. You will see whether the resource that you need to meet that maximum demand is available with you or not. So any resource where the requirement is exceeding the availability, it is a limiting factor. What is a limiting factor? That resource where the requirement exceeds the availability. A resource is a limiting factor if its availability is insufficient to meet the maximum demand of the entire production which the company wants to do. So first step is to identify which resource is that where the availability is less than the requirement, right? Step number 1. Step number 2 is calculate contribution per unit of each product. So that's very simple. What is contribution? Sales minus variable cost. We will calculate that for each product. Step 3. Calculate contribution per unit of the limiting factor. For each product, calculate the contribution per unit of the scarce resource. How? Very simple. So you calculated contribution per unit in step 2. Divided by the units of the limiting factor used in each unit. You will understand it better when we see an example. We'll be walking through a proper example on this. So how will we do it? Contribution per unit that we have computed divided by the units of limiting factor used per unit. Okay. Then what we will do is rank the products. Rank the products in descending order based on contribution per unit of the limiting factor. So basically, you will find out the contribution per unit of the limiting factor for each of the products. Whichever product gives you the highest contribution per unit of the limiting factor, that is ranked 1. Then lesser contribution per unit of the limiting factor, that will be ranked 2. So in this descending manner, you will rank the products. Okay. And then you're done with the ranking. Then you will determine the production plan basis this ranking. So you will prioritize production of products with highest contribution per unit of the limiting factor until, very important, the scarce resource is fully utilized or maximum demand is satisfied, whichever occurs first. So you have to make sure the limiting factor resource is fully utilized or the maximum demand of the product is met. So what are the 5 steps in limiting factor analysis? Step number 1, identify the limiting factor. Step number 2, calculate the contribution per unit. Step number 3, calculate contribution per unit of the limiting factor. Step 4, rank the products basis this contribution per unit of the limiting factor. And lastly, determine the production plan. Okay, so you will find out on the basis of this ranking, what should the company make and in what order, right? Now we'll look at a very good example to understand this topic in further details. This is an example of Gorgo company. It is preparing a production plan for the next week and has estimated maximum demand from its customers as follows. Product ABC, each of the products have a demand of 50 units each. The products have the following cost cards. Sales price 150, 120, 100. And the variable costs are given to you for material and labor. The production director is concerned as the materials used in production are likely to be in short supply. Gorgo does not hold any inventory of raw materials and the availability of materials is expected to be restricted to 850 kgs. Fixed costs are $4,000. Required, determine the production mix and calculate maximum Gorgo's profit next week. Assume that labor will be paid a 10% premium. Okay. So let's take a look at the answer and we'll perform this step by step. Step 1, identification of the limiting factor. So first we need to identify that each product is consuming how much of the limiting factor, right? So here it is seeming like material will be the limiting factor, but I'll show you how and why. Ma'am, why are you feeling so? Because they have given you that the supply of materials is restricted to 850 kg. But I'll explain you how that availability and requirement sails through. So material kg per unit. So if you see, they gave you the material cost over here and they gave you the rate per kg. So here the cost is what? $50. So 50 divided by 5. 50 divided by 5, that is 10 kgs of material is what A is consuming. Similarly, B is consuming how much? 30 by 5, that is 6 kgs of material. And C is consuming how much? 15 by 5, that is 3 kgs of raw material. This is the consumption per unit of each product. Then what is the demand? 50, 50, 50 for each of the products. So can I find out the requirement here? Material kgs per unit multiplied with the demand. I will get the material requirement. So what is the total? Total material requirement is 950 kgs. And how much is available? See, I told you it will turn out to be the limiting factor. See, you needed 950 kgs, but you just have 850 kgs of material. So what is the shortfall? Shortfall is 100 kgs. Okay. So can we conclude that materials is the limiting factor? Absolutely. You are facing a shortage of 100 kg. If you had 100 kgs, you could have made entire 50, 50, 50 units of ABC each. Right? But you cannot do so currently. So you need to identify how do I allocate this 850 kgs to the products ABC so that my profit is maximized. Okay. So let's move to step 2. Step 2 is contribution per unit. So we'll find that out very simple. They gave us the selling price. They gave us the variable cost. What are the variable costs? Material they gave us, and a short twist they gave us that labor will be paid a 10% premium. So whatever labor cost was given to us, basically 50 into 1.1 is what you can do because there's a 10% premium which the labor wants. So labor cost is here, whatever is given. So basically 50 into 1.1, 50 into 1.1 here and 40 into 1.1. So we get the labor cost. So that will total up, like material and labor will total up to be the variable cost. What is contribution? Sales price minus variable cost. So we get the contribution per unit. Now I have the contribution per unit. Correct. So that was step number 2, calculate contribution per unit. Third step was what? Contribution per unit of the limiting factor, and then step 4 was ranking. So we are merging both the steps over here. So I calculated contribution per unit. Good. I know the limiting factor per unit. So that is 10, 6 and 3 kgs. So I can calculate the contribution per material kg. 4.5 here. Then 5.83 here. How am I finding it out? Simply contribution per unit divided by the requirement of limiting factor per unit. Okay, so I get the contribution per material kg. And I see that C has the highest ranking. C is ranked first, then comes B, and then A. So C is the highest rank, then comes B, and then A. So what we will do now? Optimal production plan and calculation of profit. So what is the demand? Demand for C will be met first because it has got the first rank. How much will it consume? 50 units will consume 50 into 3, 150 kgs. How much do I have in total? 850 kgs, right? So do I have more material left? Yes, I still have 700 kgs left. What will I make next? 50 units of B. So 50 units multiplied with 6 kgs per unit. So 50 into 6 is 300. Do I have more materials left so that I can make A? Yes, let's find out the balancing figure. 850 minus 300 minus 150. I am left with 400 kgs of material, which I will use to make A. Now, how many units of A can I make? Can I make full 50? No. If I make full 50, I will need 950 kgs in total. But I don't have that. I just have 850 kgs. So out of the 400 kgs, what I will do? I will make 40 units. Ma'am, how did you calculate that? 400 divided by the material kgs per unit. That each unit is consuming 10 kgs now. So I have total 400 kgs. So 400 divided by 10, 40 units of A I will make. Right? So I have the number of units of A, B, and C that I can make. What I will do next is multiply this kg which I'm giving to each product with the contribution per material kg. So I'll multiply 400 with 4.5, 300 with 5.83, and 150 with 13.67. This will give me the total contribution. Ma'am, can I multiply with contribution per unit? Yes, you can, but in that case, you will need to multiply units with the contribution per unit. So you can also do it like this. Okay. So in this way, your answers will remain the same. So either you calculate, take the common base. If you're multiplying contribution by multiplying contribution per kg, you need to multiply with kg. If you're calculating contribution by multiplying with unit, then you need to multiply with the contribution per unit, like here what I've done. So contribution per unit multiplied with the number of units. So either you do unit by unit or kg by kg. Whatever you feel fine, you can do that. So I've got the contribution here, 400 into 4.5, 300 into 5.83, 150 into 13.67. So the total adds up to what? 5,600 less fixed cost given in the question that was simply given here. Look at this fixed cost of $4,000. So I've taken fixed cost as it is and I get a profit of $1,600. This is the way to allocate resource when you are faced with a limiting factor scenario. Okay, so what is the limiting factor here? Materials, we identified that in step 1 and then stepwise. Step 2, I calculated the contribution per unit for each of the product. Then I performed the ranking. How did I perform the ranking? By referring to the contribution per material kg. Whichever product gives me the highest ranking, I made that first ranked, then second, and then third. And I manufactured also in that order so that my resources are fully utilized. So I utilized total 850 kg. If I sum it up, the total comes as 850 kg. So I got 850 kgs fully utilized in making ABC. How many units? 40, 50, and 50. Not 50, 50, 50 because I don't have enough resources. And when I do that, I make a profit of $1,600. Right? So that was a full-fledged question on limiting factor analysis. I hope I was able to explain the concept to you. The question was quite elaborate, right? And what is the concept? That whenever an organization is faced with a limitation, they perform limiting factor analysis and prepare this type of a production plan. Okay? So that's all for today's session. Thank you so much. And keep studying and let me know what topic you would want me to cover in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye and please take care.